Welcome everybody to our webinar on open source in cities, and we're here with Ben Cerveny from the Foundation for Public Code, and he will tell you everything you need to know about this subject.
Hi, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for participating. I am the one of the founders of this foundation, which is now entering its second year of existence. We're in the process of building a framework and network of collaboration around the use of open source, but something a little bit beyond open source, which we call public code, among municipalities in their sort of core functions and in their relations with citizens. And I'll go a little bit deeper into that in this presentation. Just to set a little context, just wanted to take a step back and talk about where we are kind of in the history of these types of services. And you know, in the last decades, we've seen all sorts of, services that people have become dependent on, like their mobile phones and Uber and various other infrastructures that have arisen out of the technology economy, really begin to affect people's lives every day at sort of at the base level. People have adopted these technologies and they've brought them very far into their everyday life. So have municipalities in the way that they function, have become subscribers to many different types of tool sets that operate, sort of in this kind of growing digital economy that now is one of the fastest growing sectors in most of the industrialized world. And so as this all changes everything for us, really kind of fundamentally, in terms of how we spend our days, how we communicate with each other, how we move through the world, these things have changed fundamentally in the last number of years based on these kind of network technologies that we're all adopting at this fantastically fast pace. But really, we kind of have to take a step back and start to think about a lot of these other disruptive technologies we experienced as a civilization, like electricity or running water, some of these things that arrived as innovations initially. Civilization just in general is very good at taking things that they can, sort of the first couple of decades when we invent a new thing, we call it a technology, and then if it works really well, we begin to call it infrastructure, and it becomes part of like what we consider sort of the core stack of civilization. And we're now at this moment where software itself, especially software that provides us with network services behind the scenes, is really becoming something more like infrastructure than technology. And really at that point, we sort of have to ask ourselves, what does it mean for something to move from a technology to infrastructure in our lives? And one of the things that's really interesting about this inflection point, almost any sort of facet, of this type of transformation, cities have always been the site where it's sort of a crucible or a focal point for the transmutation of technology into infrastructure, because the needs of the society are so strong for change and innovation. And sort of as cities consistently change, that's one thing that cities are very good at doing, is changing while remaining organizationally whole. And this is actually a really important facet of cities that I think we're just now beginning to understand, is that they are a way in which we collectively harness technology and turn it into infrastructure. Part of the way that cities do that is that they iteratively adapt the rules of their operation to understand technology, and so in this way make technology into infrastructure. So it is through the iterative generation of policy itself, of the code that operates the city, that we actually sort of metabolize technologies into infrastructure. And this type of code that is generated, civic code, which is written by people for people to understand as part of a political process, we're now saying that code, which, by the way, I should say this slide is a really important one. Code is policy, is a way that we actually lay out a whole set of instructions by which we can operate the society. It's basically the rule space that defines the governance model for the possibility space of the whole society. So what can society become? That is generated by policy that we set down through civil code. And so the interesting part about that is that civil code has taken so many different aspects of how we live our everyday lives and turn them into these types of infrastructure, right? We have these infrastructural rights, infrastructural property, access to property. All of these things are abstract concepts that initially started out as, very kind of nonlinear and sort of ad hoc relations. And then over years, policy refined them into these kind of organizational components that operate relatively smoothly in civic society. And so you'll notice that the last sort of point on this list is software, because we've now sort of run through this process with all of these other aspects of society. And software, it turns out, has been impacting our society in ways that are as pronounced and sort of deep as these other issues that policy has managed to sort of bring into sort of civic code. So the interesting part about this movement into digital society is that the relation right now between policy and software is not one that you could consider infrastructure that is owned by the city. And instead, often the relationship between policy and software is not quite at that level yet, because we have, a set of policymakers that are just now beginning to sort of, delve into the type of literacy they're going to need in these technological issues in order to be able to create policy that is effective. They just don't understand how these systems operate, and they have very, they've been told by many sort of commercial providers and stakeholders of various types, they've been told a lot about these systems, but they don't actually have the sort of wherewithal to approach the problem space, in an informed way. Whereas on the other side, the software that's being utilized by these cities and the sort of the ways in which the providers, sort of make this software available is very proprietary and very closed, just because it's been mostly managed through, large vendor contracts, that are basically designed to extract as much value for the vendor as possible. So most of the way that that software is provisioned to cities at the moment is through licensing of, that might expire if the licensing fees aren't paid and they go up. The data that's provided by these software companies, often because the public organizations didn't understand the relationships they were getting in, they didn't actually realize the value of making sure that they owned their data, or even that they weren't giving a copy of the data away to the provider that they could then monetize in different ways. So this, this is kind of the current state of affairs in the relationship between policy and software, and something that we're sort of hoping to address in sort of our approach to public code. And sort of the underlying kind of values and principles that we're sort of moving forward with this, sort of undertaking that we're in right now, is that we sort of believe that software that runs our society is actually, software and society are slowly becoming, convergent in a way. Like a lot of the policy that cities use to define, all of these spaces, like property or transport or, various other rights that are extended to their citizens, all of those policy bases are starting to be implemented in software. And what happens if that takes place is that all of these sort of mechanisms that policy is supposed to be subject to, like open deliberation and transparency and changeability by the policymakers, that's not guaranteed in a proprietary code base. That's not guaranteed with a third-party vendor product. You're not going to necessarily know what's happening, and you're not going to necessarily be able to change it, even if your election sort of change orders are to, say, update the way the parking rules work. If you're running a proprietary code base that in your parking services, then it may be that the vendor tells you, well, actually, this change that your populace has voted for is actually not possible in our code base unless you pay us this huge change fee. And so the idea that democracy is contingent on the ability to pay vendors for software transformation is a huge weak point in the way that sort of digital society is moving. And so we're focused on this idea that governments actually, rather than be dependent on these organizations outside of themselves to, do this digital transformation, governments need to strive for technological sovereignty. And in achieving this, they then become, it's the direction of the way that these kind of functional specifications work is that they actually drive software development through policy. And we believe that public code is actually something that is at the intersection between software and policy. Public code is a full stack of sort of operation of civic infrastructure that involves both a policy element and a software element, and those things need to be able to be adapted to each other as they move forward. So, public software, it's very important that this is something that civic organizations realize, that public organizations, municipalities realize, is that public software should be subject to the same principles and processes of democratic governance that the policy mechanisms are also subject to. And thus, public software should also reflect the values of the society that it serves, which is another interesting point, is that a lot of software, I believe personally, and I believe that we're sort of beginning to understand that as a society, that software has what I call terroir. Software is actually from a specific place. And this is actually more true than things like, Italian food or French cinema or various other things. We use words to describe where certain media are from because they're contextualized culturally by the place that they've come from. And to believe that that's not the case with software is to not realize that there are a ton of decisions that are encapsulated in how software functions. And what you're doing when you make a piece of software is encapsulating those decisions in something that you're delivering to the client. And to think that the decisions that are encapsulated in a piece of transit management software, for instance, that comes from Mountain View and is deployed in a French city or in a Dutch city or any European city or global city is kind of it's a projection of values that come from a different place. And so the idea that that one needs to be able to encapsulate in software the values of the policy system in which that software is operating seems like it should be self-evident. So, at the sort of the end of this whole kind of chain of understanding is that basically public code is a type of thing that we need to become comfortable wielding as people in municipal technical infrastructure, because it sits at the intersection of both software and policy. If you make a plan to implement a library system or a school system or a transit system or a garbage management system or a tax management system, property management system, all of these things are now things that are offered as software applications by third-party vendors. But in doing that, you're subscribing to their set of values and political decisions that's sort of exported through the software. Even if you spend a lot of time working with them to customize the solution for a very specific place, the fundamental first principles on which the software is based are not going to be localized. And so the idea that public code is a library of tools that can be generated by cities for other cities that can then be traded at whatever level of abstraction and customizability those cities agree on. You could share within the context of a national scope, because there are going to be a lot of similarities of software and national scope, but also sharing on a supranational scope, like within Europe or within the global community. You start to get the benefits of scale where everyone, the cost of delivering the solution is diffused across all the members. So if you try and make open source on your own, this is the problem that a lot of municipalities are finding now when they've stepped away from sort of third-party corporate vendor solutions and into the process of trying to develop solutions for themselves in open source. You run the risk, if you don't have a community of practice, if it's only one municipality developing open source, you're not going to see the financial benefits that open source might provide, because you need to have multiple participants that are sharing the cost of development and upkeep and maintenance and support. And so something like the Foundation for Public Code is a thing that sits at the intersection of all of those needs and helps build this community of practice and the shared code base and the community of support around these tools, and so it provides a viable alternative to commercial solutions. So a lot of cities, we're finding, as we go out with this offering of the foundation, we're finding that a lot of cities already are, like I said, building these public digital infrastructure pieces, and they're actually quite successful. The OS2, which is the Danish Consortium of Municipalities for Digital Production, has built like 5 or 6 apps that are shared across something like 60 to 90 municipalities that include things like library infrastructure or ways of surveying your own IT infrastructure, or various tools around database access that abstract databases into an API that all sorts of services can use. And these tools are super valuable, but municipalities don't really have this, kind of mentality that has them looking beyond their own citizens. Their remit is to provide services and look out for the well-being of their own citizens. So they don't, within their own sort of technical infrastructure, or I should say organizations, they don't have roles that are about taking the software that they've built and sharing that with other users, other municipalities or other public organizations. However, it really is in their own interest to do that, because like I said, open source software only succeeds when it scales. It only succeeds when it has multiple users. And so there needs to be an organization that's external to each of these municipalities that is the actual brokerage for the viable and useful parts of this infrastructure that they build. So we have seen public digital infrastructure produced in all of these categories already: mapping, sharing tools, liquid democracy tools, local decision making, things like that. So all of this is, these are incredibly useful and low level. Well, they range the spectrum between low level and high level, and they really provide a toolbox that cities can go to of all sizes, right? The thing that's also nice about open source is it's not like we're building a consortium of partners in which only the partners have the license to the tool. Open source means that anyone, any municipal actor, can download these tools and begin using them for themselves. And the idea is that we help these public organizations take the code bases that they've made and package them up in ways that can be easily shared, that have documentation and things like this. So as I was saying, part of the reason why it's important that these code bases are shared is that you can diffuse the risk of development, accelerate production, because you have multiple, everyone can chip in resources to this process. And of course, super importantly, you're pushing back against the cost of development, which is, one of the main issues that people are running into around the long-term relationship with technological infrastructure in their municipalities. So, as I've said, this slide is already sort of speaks for itself, but the idea that public code bases, become a set of public infrastructure that cities build for themselves, but are also shared among municipalities, is something that I think in retrospect, we're going to come to see this like the building out of transportation infrastructures or power grids, or some of the very base levels of modern civilization that we now see as kind of the core function of public services. We're going to start to include not just access to the internet was kind of the first wave of our understanding of how public infrastructure was going to have to start managing these network services, but more importantly, what does that network do? And what the network does is provide structured services that relate to things like transportation and housing and health, that right now we find only represented in the disruptive service economy, which has a whole bunch of sort of strings attached, namely that a lot of the value is extracted back to economies from which the applications originate, but also again that they're sort of defined, their use and kind of design, and in some ways kind of ethical frameworks are designed far away. And so the idea of these public code bases is something that we found that a lot of cities, especially the cities that have already started building public digital infrastructure and have these code bases at hand and now don't really understand how to move them forward, they realize quite quickly that that the idea of something like the foundation is incredibly valuable, because this idea that there is a third party which serves as the focal point, much like there are other enormous open source code bases that have served to build the foundations of the internet, right? You have Linux, and Apache and Mozilla, Node.js, tools of this scale, which run a significant portion of the entire internet infrastructure, are things that have been developed collaboratively by many stakeholders to, become these types of infrastructural elements that support an entire global ecology. And so to a certain degree, municipalities are waking up to the power of this approach, but very specifically aimed at the idea of building public software infrastructure. And so the first, if you make one of these huge, we call them organograms, like this, big diagram that looks at an entire industry, like a lot of times you see these diagrams made for the moon landing, and it's sort of like, how many different, major types of industry did we have to influence in order to get to this one point? And it turns out that if you make a diagram about the future of technology in cities and technological sovereignty, one of the things that you immediately notice is that code-based stewardship is a choke point. Basically, if no one takes care of the software continuously, through, a lot of times you'll find that cities do, have tides of engagement with producing public digital infrastructure. For instance, Barcelona has just produced DCDM, which is an incredibly powerful tool. And Amsterdam has produced Panorama. These are two of the code bases we're initially looking at to put into stewardship. But any of these tools, if the political administration changes over time, sorry, I'm getting messaged. I don't know if that was you guys doing that, but I'll just continue. The code-based stewardship is a process that allows these applications to live on past their mandate within whatever political entity originated them. So if there's political change in an organization that creates a public digital toolkit and the new administration decides to cut funding to it, and yet it has a ton of partners elsewhere that are already using the tool, that can be problematic. And so the idea that one wants to make sure there is a third party that can provide this kind of continuity is super important. But also the idea that the third party then can build a governance model that helps these cities together understand how they're going to move the software forward and distribute development practice and also sort of build an ecology of support and use and practice around these code bases. This is super powerful stuff. So these are sort of the four aspects of code-based stewardship that we've identified that the foundation is going to be helping to provide to its members and to the communities at large that are users of our code bases. So the community development, product management, quality assurance, support. So all of these things are what we consider sort of these pillars of participation in public code. So with community, most of software for us, we've realized that open source communities, particularly, or open source applications, are almost more based on communities than they are on code bases, because really, code bases change so much over time. The community is in some ways almost like the policy organization that maintains the organizational model of what that application is going to be, throughout its lifetime, and begin to steer it through iterative development and through this ability of onboarding new members, making sure documentation is complete. And serving as a way to route support requests across people in the community. So all of this, the governance, the processing contributions to the code base and organizing events are super important. But really, a product to be viable in the current ecology and economy, there needs to be an awareness of what these tools can do and what their availability is and how viable they are as an alternative to commercial solutions. So in some ways, we need to build awareness of these tools outside of their home municipalities, so that other members and other non-members understand the value that's achievable using these tools. So for instance, DCDM, for instance, in Barcelona is a very good example of a tool that already has gone through this process, that Barcelona themselves have spent a lot of time and energy building an awareness campaign, building a process for marketing and getting the sort of word out about the utility of this tool, and thus increasing the user base and diffusing the cost of development and maintenance. So this idea that product management is really about outreach and understanding where the development needs to go among the members, are kind of both an inward and outward facing function. Quality assurance is actually a very primary function for us, because really we've developed what we call the standard for public code, which is a set of criteria against which we're going to be evaluating all the code bases that we take into stewardship, but other people can use the standard to evaluate code in the wild. And we're hoping that public code as a standard is something that people begin to consider beyond open source as a type of certification for software, which kind of looks at not only the code base. Open source just guarantees that the code base is available in public for people to comment on, and that you can actually submit contributions to the code, and those will be evaluated to be added into the application. But beyond that, for us, we're looking at things like transparency of legibility of the code, fully documentedness of the code, modularity of the code. Things that really improve its ability to be adopted and utilized to its fullest, and to be customized in the way that we were saying that these code bases should be available for, or should be adaptable for use by local contexts. And then support is really the key for anybody who's thinking about making a decision to choose a tool over a different tool in procurement. Is, do they feel confident that in 2 or 3 years' time, they can call someone, they can find someone that will help them with the problem, that they're having a problem with the software? If something goes wrong, what do they do? Who do they turn to? And a lot of times in open source communities, that's one of the biggest problems in getting people to participate, is that that they don't believe, they can look at a procurement response and from a private vendor, you sign a service level agreement that says you're going to pay us this much money every year. However, we're going to be there for a certain amount of time, guaranteed, to support your needs with the software. Whereas with open source, often these solutions are supported by a programmer in the forest in Norway or something, and that person gives you no guarantee that they're going to be there to support. They may take a commercial job with one of the big providers and not have any time to even advance the tool anymore. So the idea that we can build a community of practice and build a community of technically literate people, much like the earlier examples of open source I was talking about, like Apache, is a tool that doesn't really, it doesn't come into its own unless there is a local service provider that can actually implement it in a context, right? A web server is only something once you have fully kitted it out with the content that you're hoping to serve. And so similarly, a lot of these applications are going to be services that need quite a bit of a localization and refinement into local markets. And the idea is that we're enabling a whole ecology of people that understand how to use these tools, that can respond to procurement requests with our tools to back them up, with the sort of validation of public code as a seal of approval. Then they can be implementers in their home economy and their home ecology, and bring that forward. So just an example I was just going to bring up here, some of our partners in the foundation at the moment, and they've all, many of them have offered up these code bases that we're going to be taking in. And so the idea is that we're going to the first phase of our relationship with the code bases that are coming from our partners is that we submit them to assessment against the foundation. So all of these tools, Panorama, which I've spoken of, is a Street View-like tool that allows you to acquire 360 images of your city that then can be privacy, the faces will be blurred, license plates blurred, people can opt in and out of whether they want their addresses blurred, and then they're put on the map an OpenStreetMap in a geodatabase registered there and available for use by both internal municipal processes and also possibly for citizens, depending on what cities want to do with that. DCDeem is an online decision-making tool that's often used in collaborative budget-making processes. It's been used significantly in projects in Barcelona around very small urban planning interventions where participatory budgeting is done around, ways of retrofitting intersections with new furniture. And then Kitos is a project, like I said, from this consortium in Denmark, which is about managing one's IT portfolio, which we find to be really useful in the context of the foundation itself. It allows you to catalog which vendors you're using for which pieces of infrastructure and when those contracts expire and how much you're paying, so that if you are in a collective sort of group of people that all have services expiring at the same time, you can go to the vendor and group negotiate, or you can decide to spend together on a new solution in open source. So code-based stewardship is the thing that, once we've done this assessment, we actually take on these code bases and we begin the process of managing them going forward. So the idea that we will be looking at all of the contributions in code and reviewing those as compliant with our standard, and then providing the other services that I was talking about, product management and support going forward. So one of the things that we find really that cities, our members and other cities have found super useful that we've already produced above and beyond this idea of the process of code-based stewardship is the standard itself. And so if you, there's a URL there at the bottom of the page, standard.publiccode.net. And if you go visit that, I encourage you especially to read the introduction, because it actually spells out a little bit more long form some of the points that I'm making now. But also this whole standard allows you to understand what the criteria are that we're looking for in a successful code base that can be used as public code. And also it allows you to understand, given different actors, whether they're policymakers, management, designers, and developers, each of those stakeholders has a different relationship with how they want to both, use this standard to evaluate their the code bases that they're working on. So it's actually quite actionable and accessible, and it really begins to, get people thinking about how they want to reform their own software development practices to meet the standard and to deliver better results that are more reusable beyond the context of their home institutions. So a little bit about the foundation. We're actually an association, which means that we're owned by our members, and all of those members are public organizations. And so technically we are also a public organization. So in some ways it becomes interesting that we are not actually, for some of our members, the way that they're structured, we're not actually even considered an external organization, because we're the line item that they're going to be paying us through is that we are actually part of, that we're owned by them as an external entity, and therefore we're within kind of direct spending capabilities, which is an interesting sort of arrangement. But what it also means is that they, as owners, are part of our board, right? There's a general assembly that will be made up of a representative of all of our members. And then from that general assembly will be elected a council, a board of directors, and that board of directors will be constituent by the different cities and other public organizations that we have as members. And so in that way, the governance of the entire activity of the foundation can be overseen and directed by the members. It's nonprofit and nonpartisan, and of course principled around this idea that we stand for this idea of technological sovereignty, and that cities should be able to sort of shape the technology that they operate with as infrastructure and into their own policy landscape. So just a little heads up on where we're at. We are this year establishing both the governance model with the foundation's founding members and designing and testing our code-based stewardship process. So this is kind of a boot up year for us. Like I said, founding members are all public organizations committed to collaborative public development. public code development, which means that there many of them, like Barcelona and Amsterdam and OS2, and a couple of other members that are coming on board soon, they're all very much forefront in thinking about and in developing around these concept of digital public infrastructure software for cities by cities. So the founding members have these sort of characteristics. They work together, they ensure that we can scale, and they take the initiative and control. So we're looking to really build a network of collaborators tightly sort of focused around some of this thing. I'm just really quickly talking through where we're going with the founding members. I won't read through this explicitly, but we have great commitment from our initial partners, and we're looking to extend that as we go through this first year. We're bringing on founding members, and that is very much to be deeply knit into the DNA of understanding what it means to build public code and what it means to be a city that plans to define itself around an open and adaptive and iterative relationship between policy and software at the core levels. And I think I will stop there. Just really quickly, we're, like I said, going into the second half of 2019. We're getting founding members on board, building the organization next year, and then in 2021 we plan to hit full scale and start offering. I mean, we will be offering already these code bases under Stewardship, but I think by 2021 we plan to have a sustainable model going forward that's based on membership fees and structural funding, and we'll be offering a number of code bases that hit a variety of different aspects of the operation. So we're also hiring. So the last little bit I want to leave you with was, if you know any people within your own local ecologies of developers that you think might be a good fit for a mission like this. We're looking for lots of people that are literate in working with open source projects, especially people that have helped to maintain open source projects before. Because as I said, it turns out that the cities that have developed code bases are some of those that are most eager to recognize the value of open source. And so they're really coming forward with some really valuable code bases that really would be quite useful for other cities to be able to use. But in order to build the capacity for ourselves to be able to take those on and really provide the kind of stewardship that we need to meet our own standards, we're going to need to grow our team pretty quickly. So it's a pretty exciting time. We've seen a lot of uptake and a lot of interest. And a lot of people understanding the value of what we're talking about right now. So we're growing fast, and we're really excited. So thanks so much for your time, and please don't hesitate to drop me a line at ben@publiccode.net or find me on the internet. And thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Ben. That was great. So if the local authorities who are watching this video want to know more about public code, everything is in the document standard for public code?
Yeah, that's the standard, and then also they should look at the website publiccode.net, particularly in the about section has all of we're a completely transparent organization, so okay. We are putting all of our statutes and processes and sort of governance model is online there. We're using GitHub to maintain our own documents about the foundation. It's our first code base, honestly, the foundation itself. So all of that is explorable on the about.publiccode.net URL.
Okay. And if local authorities want to join as founding members, what's the best way to proceed? To contacting you directly? Yeah,
contacting me or Boris at publiccode.net. Also, I can send a little email for you guys to forward around that has our contact info on it.
And full operation in 2021 then?
Yeah, I mean, we're still going to be, we're already operational. We're taking on code bases now, evaluating them. We're in the assessment phase. Probably by the end of the year, we're going to have our first implementations of one member's code base by another. But these are all, you know, sort of the first iterations of the process. So we're still going to be working the kinks out of that. And we hope, you know, by 2020, I think we're going to try and scale to, you know, a significant, you know, ideally we're going to hit hundreds of members like Eurocities or whatever, but I think we're going to try and ramp that. But I think so by 2021, we're talking about hitting something like 100 members. But, you know, the 2020, we're going to sort of scale that in batches to make sure that we can actually manage all of the code bases successfully with that many contributors. I mean, if you think about something like Linux or Apache, you think about, I mean, obviously that's, you know, millions of people that use those tools, and there are millions of municipalities, but there are hundreds of thousands of municipalities. And the idea that one could find a tool that was useful enough that was fully subscribed by, you know, some large percentage of that user base, that's an enormous task to run that software operation. So we need to really, I mean, we're not planning on achieving that anytime in the next year, but the idea that we would build the, you know, the ability to scale our operation to meet those types of needs is something we need to be able to do before we actually start releasing code bases that might scale that way.
Okay, good. I think we are going to end the webinar here.
Okay, great.
And again, if people want to contact you, it's your name and surname at publiccode.net, or is it just Ben?
Yeah, I'm gonna sorry, I'm gonna put the slide back up again. If that's
okay, so Ben at publiccode.net.
Yeah.
For any, yeah. Okay, good. Thank you very much, Ben.
All right.
And, we'll see you on the 25th for the next webinar. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.